Well, good morning, everyone. I apologize for the last minute link going out for the session today. We had a bit of a problem. I think we'll probably have a bit of a smaller group than we did last week because of the last minute email that went out. I'm not sure if people received it or not. So anyway, good morning. My name is Trevor Schell, and I'd like to welcome you all to the second of 4 weekly webinars being held during the month of February as part of our annual RSI Day webinar series, focused on the recognition and prevention of musculoskeletal disorders. RSI Day has grown to become the world's largest ergonomics-focused webinar series, which is illustrated on the map you're seeing on the screen right now. Today, halfway through this year's event, we have over 1,900 registrants from 63 different countries, making this our most successful year ever for registrations. I hope that it continues to grow until someday the entire map is colored red. That could only be accomplished with your help. So please continue to share information about our annual webinar series with your friends and colleagues and help us to expand our reach so that workplaces around the world recognize the importance of preventing musculoskeletal disorders. This week's always marks my favorite part of the series because for the next 3 weeks, I actually get to relax and enjoy the presentations, unlike last week when I was presenting, along with my co-presenter, Catherine Jelly-Fair, on the implications of limping and other gait pathologies in the development of symptoms in the opposite leg and the spine. We are also joined by my fellow ergonomist, Daryl Stevenson, who delivered a practical session on applying ergonomics at home. If you were unable to attend last week's session, you should have received an email earlier this week advising that a recording had been uploaded to our YouTube channel. If you did not receive that email, please check your junk or spam folder. Now, we ask that everyone remain muted for the duration of the webinar, as there will be an opportunity to ask questions following each session. It will be monitored by my colleague, Dwayne, so please post any questions for the speakers there. You'll also notice a survey on the side of your screen. Please take a moment to complete this survey, as well as the follow-up one that will be available near the end of today's session. Your feedback is very important to us and helps to guide future programming. I've also received numerous questions regarding documentation for educational certification for attending. Documentation can be provided. However, we first recommend that you check with your governing body to determine whether the Eventbrite registration will be sufficient. That confirmation from Eventbrite includes details such as the session date, duration, and topic, which many organizations accept as proof of attendance. If it's not sufficient, we would be happy to supply a certificate of attendance after the webinar concludes on February 27th. At that time, please email me your dates of the sessions you attended. And once we have verified your live attendance, the appropriate documentation will be issued. Please note we were unable to issue any certificates for sessions that were not attended live, as we do not have a method to validate that process. Now today, we're bringing you two very different topics, very similar to last week's, with one being more technical and science-based, and the other more focused on everyday practical considerations. Our first session is entitled Understanding Fatigue and Occupational Hand Tasks, and will be presented by Mike Holmes, a professor and Canadian Research Chair from Brock University. Personally, I've long felt that the role of fatigue plays in the development of MSDs has been overlooked. For decades, it has been grouped under the term repetitive motion as a primary risk factor. However, repetition alone is not the issue. Inadequate recovery is. Repetition is not inherently harmful. What matters is whether the body has given sufficient time to recover. The term repetitive motion has been used imprecisely, sometimes to the detriment of injured workers whose compensation claims have been denied because their work was not deemed repetitive enough. I often laugh when I see this used in denials of injured workers' compensation claims because how much is too much? How do they quantify that? It's subjective. It can't be. There's no gold standard that can be applied. Fatigue, on the other hand, can be measured, observed, and meaningfully addressed. My hope is that today's session will help spark a broader discussion, perhaps even a shift in how we describe and assess this risk. And yes, the irony is not lost to me that I'm hosting an event called Repetitive Strain Injury Day. The name's not mine to change. RSI Day was created 27 years ago by a group of injured workers, individuals who had been harmed by their work, and wanted to increase awareness and push for greater recognition of these disorders, particularly amongst governments and compensation systems. The name remains as a way of honoring their efforts and continuing to advocate in their behalf. So thanks for indulging me for that brief soapbox moment. But anyone that's ever attended RSI Day over the years knows I'm deeply passionate about the subject. And our second session today will be entitled Ergonomics and Pregnancy, and will be presented by my fellow ergonomists Andrew Flanagan and Melissa Statham, along with OHCOW Occupational Health Coordinator Jessica Montgomery. So with that being said, please just give us a moment to switch over, and Mike will begin his presentation. Mike, you all set?
Believe so. Can you see my slides?
I see it perfectly. You're good to go, sir.
Excellent. Okay. So thank you for the introduction, Trevor. And I just want to say thanks to the OHCOW team for the invitation to speak today at the RSI webinar series. I've been following the event for a number of years now, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So as Trevor mentioned, today I'm going to talk about our lab's research over the past few years that's focused on trying to better understand how neuromuscular fatigue impacts hand performance. First, I would like to set the stage a little bit with some context. So as Trevor mentioned, I run a research lab at Brock University, and in our lab, we have a focus on better understanding the mechanisms of work-related musculoskeletal disorders. And we do this through a neuromechanical lens. And what we mean by that is we combine techniques from biomechanics and neurophysiology to understand or explore how humans control the hand and upper extremity. And we are obviously passionate about this topic and sort of view it from the perspective that how we interact with tools and objects is one of the most fundamental and vital aspects of human movement. And despite all that we know about human movement, the events that take place at the spinal cord and the brain to try to develop control strategies to compensate for unstable dynamics, think even holding or manipulating a cup of coffee today or manipulating a tool at work, are not entirely understood. So our lab has this sort of underlying hypothesis or goal to the work that we do. And it's that our ability to interact with our environment is remarkable given this complex biomechanical and neural circuitry. However, our limited understanding of this interaction is a key reason why it's so difficult to identify injury mechanisms. So in terms of, with that setting the stage for the direction of the talk, here's the outline for today. I'm going to start off by talking about hand and wrist RSIs, briefly mention some statistics and some mechanisms of injury. I'm going to follow that with a very brief overview of neuromuscular fatigue, and then talk in a bit more detail about the connection between fatigue and injury, and the connection also between fatigue and performance decrements in particular. I will follow that up by highlighting some studies from our research group that has evaluated forearm muscle function and fatigue. And then to Trevor's point, he had a great little summary to introduce my talk today. We've chatted about this numerous times over the years. And so I want to end by hopefully getting people to think a little bit deeper towards some of this the commonly cited quote unquote mechanisms of injury. And in particular, I want us to consider the relationship between repetition, fatigue, and recovery. And so, to Trevor's comment that at the start, I'll present the idea that we may want to take some of the focus away from repetition as a risk factor and think more broadly about how repetition translates to inadequate recovery. So to get things started, let's talk about hand and wrist RSIs for a moment. I'm sure that everyone attending today or who will listen later in the webinar certainly knows all too well the burden of musculoskeletal disorders. They are the number one reason why people miss work, and they translate to enormous costs. Costs to our healthcare system, costs to employers, and of course, costs to families and individuals. And these costs can be in the form of money, but also stress. We'll focus on the hand and wrist here, but the consequences are no different for other parts of the body as well. And some statistics here suggest that 1 in 10 Canadians report RSIs serious enough to limit normal activities. Most of these RSIs are largely work-related, and many of them, a high percentage, involve the upper extremity. Depending on how you break those statistics down between the neck, shoulder, hand, and wrist, they make up a large portion of RSIs. There's also financial costs associated with this, and in Ontario, MSDs represent over 40% of all lost time claims and very large direct and indirect costs associated with them. And of course, as I mentioned, there's a high human cost. Those who report RSIs are twice as likely to report chronic pain and elevated psychological stress. And these problems tend to persist well after injuries are sustained. And of course, we know that MSDs are truly a global burden. I mentioned some Canadian statistics there, and I'm coming to you from Canada, but we all face the same challenges. There's some good statistics from the EU, some surveys that report very similar statistics in terms of upper limb pain being widespread among workers. And the costs are enormous, as I've mentioned. Hand and wrist MSDs have the longest sick absences and are among the most expensive occupational injuries to rehab. We narrow it down into a claim that's easily tracked or easier tracked than some other types of repetitive strain injuries is carpal tunnel syndrome. And you can see that the cost per case and overall cost associated with that type of injury is quite substantial. So our lab tackles the upper limb, and we have a view that really the upper limb and hand in particular is an engineering marvel. Most activities of daily living and work tasks involve manipulating objects and tools with our hands. And as I mentioned briefly a minute ago, even trivial human object interactions require this complex, coordinated series of events from the brain to the limb. And I think this becomes even more apparent today if we start to look at recent robotics and robotic devices that are being shown and advertised quite regularly these days. If we look at these devices in detail, the design needed to replicate hand function is extremely complex engineering. So to replicate the degrees of freedom and the device diverse force requirements required from fine manipulation to large force production requires incredibly complex and sophisticated engineering solutions. Now, the distal upper extremity is a complex system. And as I was preparing for the talk, I was reflecting a little bit and thought about some of my graduate school days. And when I first started to do some work in this area, I was tasked with doing some cadaver research. And I dissected my first cadaver hand. The picture's small there on the screen. I didn't want to make it too big for people who might not want to be staring at cadavers this morning. But one of the first things that I noticed was that, I prepared so much for this type of research and studied as much as I could. And then I opened up a cadaver hand for the first time and realized that it was nothing like the textbook. There's incredible amounts of anatomical variation, um, which is likely a positive from the terms, from the sense of this creates movement variability. But there's also injury predisposition associated with this anatomical variation as well. The wrist, for instance, has many different anatomical variants. There are people who have different sort of number of arteries, vascular structures, nerves, tendons, and muscles can be different among individuals. And an example is that for some people, some of the population has an extra part of the median artery, and then in other people, the anatomical differences suggest that muscles like the FDS and FDP, which are prime grasping and pinching muscles, not just the tendons, but the muscles themselves can actually travel inside the carpal tunnel. But that doesn't happen in everybody. The thenar muscles have the same sort of situation where they can sometimes travel inside the tunnel, and that predisposes some people to injury, uh, and other people don't have that sort of problem to deal with. So there's incredible complexity here. There's anatomical and biomechanical considerations. Some of the motor control literature would suggest that we have what's called a redundant, and then other people argue and say that it's an abundant musculoskeletal system. But this simply means that we have multiple muscles that are capable of performing the same actions or tasks. And so this is really good in one sense because it offers task variability. Our carpal tunnel in the wrist can act as a pulley system. So this can provide a mechanical advantage to some structures or muscles over others. And of course, we know that as I mentioned, the force control required is substantial in the upper extremity, from power grip requirements to fine, precise precision tasks and movements. And then complicating this even further is the fact that most tasks and actions that we do, especially at work, involve combinations of gripping with wrist actions. And so we call these dual task conditions. And many of the muscles contribute to both gripping and wrist actions, both independently and combined together. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that when I talk about our research projects in a second. So why is the hand vulnerable? There are a lot of biomechanical considerations at play here, and there's a quote from an older paper from Schneider's that stuck with me years ago when I first read the paper, and they said that grasping and pinching always cause a flexing moment at the wrist. To avoid flexion of the joint, there must be equilibrium moments. And so this suggests that when we grasp an object, the flexor muscles will cause the wrist to want to produce wrist flexion. And we have muscles on the other side of that system, the extensor muscles, that need to balance that if we need to stabilize our wrist joint. So in terms of the biomechanical considerations, the flexors, the wrist flexors as a whole, greatly outweigh, if we were to balance the system, the extensors. There are large disparities in things like the cross-sectional area. As a whole, the flexor muscles are larger than the extensor muscles. They have larger force generating capacities. They have mechanical advantages in terms of their moment arms and the size of those moment arms. And the muscles on the flexor side tend to be directed in more straight lines of action so that they contribute purely to wrist actions in direct rotations, whereas the extensors are a little bit more complex in terms of their lines of action. So this is not surprising then that the extensors are likely predisposed to fatigue and injury due to this large biomechanical disadvantage and the need to be activated to balance what the flexors are doing for most of our activities. Now, I don't want to complicate things too much here, but there are also neurophysiology considerations, and it's not going to be the focus of the talk here at all, but I just wanted to mention it briefly that we've done some work in this area to show that we can keep the forearm muscles from a biomechanical perspective constant. In this picture, we've got a person with their arm resting on a platform, and we don't manipulate the elbow or the wrist, so we keep the forearm muscles constant, and we simply change arm orientation. And when we do that, the quality of the signal that gets sent from the brain to the muscle is actually affected and changed. And so this actually has implications to we've shown that central drive to the muscle can be impacted, and this can influence and guide workplace design considerations. But again, won't be the focus of the talk here today. So for the second part of this talk, let's get into this idea and topic of fatigue and how it's related to both injury and performance. So neuromuscular fatigue is a very complex process. And it truly, if there's one thing I can highlight today, right, it's that it's truly a process. As soon as we start exercising, as soon as we start doing a workplace task, the fatigue process starts and it accumulates over time. So it's not really this binary, you're fatigued or you're not process. It's sort of a cascading of events over time. In terms of the definitions, we tend to resort back to some popular ones by OHCOW that suggest that neuromuscular fatigue is a reduction in the ability of a muscle to produce force. That's considered these days performance fatigability. And then there's also another side to the definition, which is around the subject's sense of tiredness. And that's often termed perceived fatigability. Now, mechanistically, these performance fatigability and perceived fatigability changes are reflected in alterations in the neuromuscular system. And peripheral changes are largely driven by adaptations at the muscular level. So metabolite accumulation, muscle properties change, cross-bridge function changes and impairs contractile properties. And then there's also central factors that can change in terms of anything along the central nervous system that's affected from the motor cortex through the spinal cord, almost all the way out to the neuromuscular junction is referred to as a central change in fatigue. So we have this very complicated system, and I'm going to talk about this some more in some of the studies that I'm going to cover because it's important, I think, to revisit this as some of the changes that we've observed in our research with fatigue results back to what type of fatigue is being initiated. Is it central or peripheral? So I put together a schematic to try and highlight how we view this progression of fatigue to injury and how they're connected. And I know this is simplistic. There's a lot of variables and factors that go into play, but from our research, we're focusing in on what's highlighted on the screen here. And so we view this as there is some sort of typically a biomechanical strain, and from our work and the focus of these talks, it's around the workplace. And so these are task level factors, things like repetition, force, posture, all of the mechanisms that we often talk about in terms of characterizing somebody's work. So these task level factors cause biomechanical strain that will likely result in local muscle fatigue. That local muscle fatigue is influenced then by all sorts of other factors. There's individual factors and psychosocial factors that come into play that we won't talk about. But that local muscle fatigue will often result in reduced force generating capacity of the muscles. It will result in altered neuromuscular control, and it can also result in changes in joint mechanics. And all three of these changes as a result of fatigue can, in their own way or combined, increase tissue loading. And of course, as we all know, as tissues loading gets increased, damage is likely to occur. There's microtrauma and inflammation, and then this can eventually result in a musculoskeletal outcome or an increased risk of an MSD. Now, on the other side of the equation, which is a large part of what I'm going to talk about today, is that fatigue also has a large impact on performance. And in particular, at the hand, fatigue can impair hand function. So we've completed a systematic review in this area. And one of the key things that became apparent from this review paper was truly around the complexity of fatigue and how important the type, quantifying or characterizing the type of fatigue matters for the outcome. And what I mean by that is we have a graphic here on the right that was from the paper, and we really had to break things down in terms of the research that's been done in maximal and submaximal contractions, and then breaking those types of contractions down further into, were contractions sustained and static, or were they repetitive contractions? And you can see that, as depending on the type of contraction and the type of fatigue protocol, the type of impairment or performance impairment changes. There could be changes in force generating capacity, um, proprioception, or measured by joint position sense, reaction time, force variability. All of these things are affected by fatigue, but in unique ways based on the type of contractions and the type of protocols that were studied. So I'm going to try to iron out some of those details in the rest of the talk and clarify some of those with some of the work that we've been doing. So I want to spend a little bit of time here now talking about our evaluation of forearm muscle function. And I'm going to break this up into three themes. We've been spending a lot of time in this area, and I want to start by talking about some work that we've done defining muscle roles during what we call dual task scenarios. And I mentioned this early on as well. A lot of the work and the research that's been done to date has done a really good job of documenting muscle contributions to tasks in isolation. So we have a good understanding of the muscles involved in gripping or pinching. And we have a good understanding of the muscles and their contributions to wrist actions, like twisting and torque actions of the wrist. But they've always been studied in isolation, and there's much less research on these dual tasks where we have combinations of wrist actions and grip force requirements. And once I set the stage for how that's sort of been looking in our work, I want to take it a step further and get into this fatigue piece a little bit more. Given that we have these known biomechanical disparities that I've highlighted off the top, where the flexors have large mechanical advantages compared to the extensors, we've been sort of thinking about this from the perspective of how might that influence neuromuscular fatigue, and does fatiguing the flexors versus the extensors uniquely influence task performance. And then finally, we've been spending quite a bit of time in this area, and it's ongoing. Something that we're looking forward to continuing into the future is developing assessments, and the ones I'm going to focus on today are called sensory motor assessments, to evaluate mechanical changes, which in our view are hopefully going to provide us with some insights into function, maybe injury risk, kind of getting at an idea of identifying biomarkers that might help us predict injury in the future. So the first part of this was defining muscle roles during dual tasks with wrist and grip force requirements. And some of this work is building on some earlier work from some colleagues here in Canada. Many of you have probably heard the name Richard Wells before. Richard's done some work in this area where they quantified all the forces and moments required to grasp and manipulate like a tool, as shown on the left-hand side of the screen here. So what we did in our project was, this is a picture from the paper. I apologize if it's showing up black and white here. So we have electrodes over muscles of the forearm, and those electrodes measure muscle activation or activity. And we have a setup where we can put a force transducer on either the flexor or extensor side of the wrist. We've termed it palmar and dorsal side in the picture here. And so that allows us to have people exert forces or torques into the transducer to generate wrist flexion or extension. And then the person is also grasping the handle of a hand grip dynamometer. So we can also have a measurement of grip force. And what we did, we came up with a protocol where we had these, what we called combined efforts that totaled 40% of the person's maximal output. And we had conditions that really ranged the spectrum. So we had, for instance, condition 1 here that you can see in the table would be the person's required to do no hand grip task and purely exert a wrist torque in either the flexion or extension direction. And then if I skip down to the condition 5, it would be the complete opposite. The task would be purely a hand grip only task and no wrist torque actions. And then the conditions in between vary the levels of contributions. And this is where our dual tasks happen, where people have to perform various levels of contraction of either the hand grip and wrist torque simultaneously. Now, it was a bit tricky to set up. I won't show the experimental setup, but basically people would see real-time force traces of their torques and hand grip forces, and we would have them exert to a particular line on a computer screen, and they would have to hold that exertion for a specified period of time. And then we can go back and look at what the muscle activation data looks like. And so I have this slide is probably the busiest in terms of actual data that I'm going to show today. Most of the other slides are just going to summarize our findings, but I wanted to show this because it sets the stage for some of the other work that we're going to talk about. So what I have here is these are 3 of the flexor muscles that we recorded from. So we have FCR, flexor carpi radialis, FDS, flexor digitorum superficialis, and FCU, flexor carpi ulnaris. I've broken things down into whether the wrist torques were in the palmar or dorsal directions. And we have muscle activity along the side here, which is normalized as a percentage of the person's maximal output, which is a common way of interpreting our muscle activity data. And then each of the bars are shaded different colors, and they represent the variety of conditions that we had. So the darkest bar would have been purely a wrist action, and then the lightest bar, the white bar, would be purely a grip action. And the different shades of bars in between are those various conditions of dual task combinations. And I don't want to get into the weeds here around this because there's a lot of data to talk about. But if I were to sort of summarize some of this in general, we see that for the flexors, we have a large decline as grip is progressively more involved. And or sometimes we also in some muscles have this U-shaped dispersion. So we clearly observe that the combined effects are not necessarily equal to the activity required by that muscle for a task in isolation. The activity tends to get shared and dispersed when it's a dual task. And for the extensors, there's a very different story. If I leave the flexors up on the screen here, and you can see that there's large changes in muscle activation from over 30% to less than 10%, depending on the task condition. But we don't necessarily see that in the extensors. We see much more constant activity, regardless of the task, if it's a purely wrist action or purely a grip action or these combinations in between. We often see much more, we see less variability and much more constant activity throughout the task. So in terms of forearm muscle function, what we've boiled this down to is that, and some of this has been talked about before, and I think some of our work on dual tasks highlights this from a different perspective from isolated tasks, but we see some of the same findings transfer over to dual tasks. We see that the wrist extensors tend to be classified, and rightfully so, as the wrist joint stabilizers. They tend to exhibit, if we look at the muscle activity data, and I've just highlighted an EMG trace in the bottom left here of the screen. If we were to look at our EMG data from the extensors, it often looks like you see here. It exhibits static, low-level activity, but the muscle is being activated for long periods of time. Versus the wrist flexors, the activation patterns look very different. They tend to be the prime movers, especially for grasping and pinching, and they exhibit what we call task-dependent activity. So we really see these bursts of activity on and off. So there's work and there's rest. And depending on the task, those patterns will change, but it looks very different than what happens on the extensor side. Even if the extensors are the prime movers, we tend to see this low-level exertion or activity throughout the task. So we've done this work with isometric contractions at different magnitudes of people's maximal contraction capacity. We've also done it evaluated this with dynamic wrist actions, and I won't Won't talk about those today for the sake of time, but we've explored this we've moved from isometric contractions to dynamic actions, and the same findings translate. We see that the wrist flexors are task dependent, the extensors have constant activity. And if we look at co-contraction, which is often a measure of neuromuscular efficiency and joint loading, these co-contraction variables are largely driven by the extensors. So we thought, okay, with this in mind, what are some of the next steps that we need to take? And given, as I've mentioned, we know these large discrepancies in the flexors and extensors, so we thought let's explore flexor versus extensor fatigue and try to better understand if one group, when they're fatigued, has a larger influence on hand performance or tracking performance than the other. So, how does neuromuscular fatigue uniquely influence task performance? And I was drawn to another older research paper by Haig and Millard. They had a nice quote from one of their papers that said, "It's remarkable that the fatigue signs generally are more pronounced on the extensor side, in spite of the fact that FDS is the prime mover." And so they did a lot of work back in the 90s in the automotive and manufacturing fields. And they really showed this, that the extensors tend to be the muscles that show more signs of fatigue than the flexors, despite the fact that the flexors are often the prime force generating muscles for many of the tasks that we're monitoring. So, given this idea, the wrist extensors likely have an earlier onset of fatigue. We wanted to explore if there's unique influences on performance with extensor fatigue and start to evaluate some of these potential mechanisms around does the type of fatigue influence the outcomes? And I mentioned, central versus peripheral mechanisms earlier. And so these are the types of questions that we wanted to explore a little bit further. So the purpose of the work was to examine the influence of forearm muscle fatigue on strength and performance during a hand tracking task. And specific questions were around how do various forearm muscle fatigue protocols impair performance? And is there greater impairment with either flexor or extensor fatigue? So to do this, we have a robotic device in my lab, and I'm going to talk about this quite a bit in the remainder of the slides here. This is the first picture you're seeing of it, but this robotic device, I'll kind of set things up here and explain it a little bit. But the participant would come into the lab, and in this case, you can see that we've put electrodes over muscles again to measure muscle activations. But the person rests their forearm on a platform, and they grasp the handle of the device. And the robot has motors, actuators set up in here so that the robot can apply resistance or even assistance if we wanted to the person's movements. And the robot handle can move in all degrees of freedom of the human wrist. So what we've been able to do with this is come up with a variety of different protocols. And I won't be able to talk about them all today for the sake of time, but we've been studying this from a lot of different angles. We've been doing fatigue protocols that are isometric, that are dynamic, that are maximal contractions, and that are submaximal contractions. And as you can all appreciate, of course, we can then break down submaximal contractions into various work to rest ratios and duty cycles. And so there's a lot of ways that we could be tackling this problem. And we're working our way through all of these different protocols. And then we target with multiple sessions or visits to the lab, we would target one day the participant would have their flexor muscles fatigued and they would perform tasks with the robot. And then on another day, they would have their extensor muscles fatigued and come back in and perform the same tasks on the robot. So the main task that I'm going to highlight today is a tracking task, and people would have to complete this pattern on the computer screen in front of them, and it's called a 3x2 Lissajous curve, and it has large ranges of wrist motion and actions, and we can set the speed and requirements here. But the person would see a target on the screen in front of them, and that's highlighted here by the blue icon. And then the participants, the location of their handle is overlaid on top of that as the participant's position. So the robot would move um, their target location around this track, and the person would have to manipulate the handle of the robot and try to follow and track the shape and speed of the robot as best they could. We've done a variety of different projects now, and I'm going to, again, focus on just a couple of them for the sake of time, but we've maintained our protocols and they've been consistent over our studies. And the main thing that changes here is the fatigue protocol. It's highlighted in blue. So the first study that I'll mention here was an isometric fatigue protocol. And then in a couple of slides, you'll see the same picture again, but you'll notice that the fatigue protocol has changed and it'll say dynamic. So people come into the lab and we prep them with our muscle activity data and electrodes, and we get them all set up. We get them familiarized with the robot, and they do some practice trials of this trace to try to remove some familiarization and motor learning aspects. And then following some rest, we would have them do baseline tracking. So they would do multiple trials of this Lizard trace, and that would be our pre-fatigue performance measures. Then we would have them do the fatigue protocol, and it would either be focused on the flexors or the extensors. And then immediately post fatigue protocol, we would have them do the tracking task again. And we set this up to be testing all the way out to about 10 minutes post fatigue protocol. So it starts to give us a better sense of how people recover from these fatigue sessions over time. And this is just one screenshot sample of an individual person's trace, and you can kind of get a sense of, people aren't going to be perfect doing this trace, especially as they're learning it and getting better at it over time. But so here's an example of our baseline measurement from an individual. The black is the perfect trace, the ideal target from the robot, and then the blue is the participant's ability to recreate that trace. And you can see in a fatigued condition, there are clearly hand impairments. Now we can track those with a variety of different measures, and we measure something called tracking error, which is an overall measure of performance in all directions, and we can also break that down into sort of flexion, extension, radial ulnar deviation errors. We track something, there's some math involved in it, but we track something called figural error, which is how well the participant reproduces the shape of the trajectory. And this one's insensitive to speed, which is kind of interesting because sometimes people are very good at completing the trace, but they might always be ahead of the target or always behind the target. But that shouldn't necessarily penalize their overall error. And so figural error allows us to capture that. And we also measure something called jerk ratio, which is a measure of movement smoothness. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So one of our first projects in this area was looking at isometric fatigue. And so we've published a paper where we had people do a sustained maximal isometric fatigue test. So it's very acute fatigue generated, right? It's fatigue generated over a short period of time. People would come into the lab and we would position them underneath a force transducer outside of the robot in this case. We've also done fatigue protocols in the robot, but in this case, people were positioned out of the robot, in this case, set up into a wrist flexion condition, and they were to exert a maximal contraction isometrically against the force transducer to produce a wrist flexion torque. And they were told to hold that for as long as possible. Some people will hold close to their maximum for longer than others, and some people have sharper or more steep progressive declines of fatigue over time. So this is just a hypothetical curve shown on the right and not actual data from somebody's collection. But the point is that it's likely over a relatively short period of time. People are contracting as hard as they can for as long as they can. And then we have a cutoff criteria of when their forces decline to about 25% of their maximum. Just to show you what some of the tracking error metrics look like, and I won't show too much of this data. I'll just summarize it on some of the following slides in terms of our main findings. But in this case, we've got a graph that shows our tracking error. So this is overall error. and it's normalized as a percentage of baseline, so the pre-fatigue values, which is considered the dotted line here of 100%. And so larger values mean more error in this case. 0 would be our time point immediately after the fatigue protocol. And then 1, 2, all the way out to 10 are different time points that we tested in terms of the recovery stages. The black line represents the day that the person had their wrist extensors fatigued, and the gray line represents the day or the session where they had their wrist flexors fatigued. And one of the things that stands out here, you can see it quite clearly, is that there is large impairments immediately following the fatigue protocol. But we were actually quite surprised to see that recovery re- performance recovered very, very rapidly and quickly following this protocol. So our summary findings from that is our max wrist torques, when we tested them against, we had people, I should have mentioned this at the start, we obtained their max wrist torque levels or contraction levels for extension and flexion. And then we also, at the end of the entire thing, after all these repetitions and traces into the recovery period, 10 minutes post fatigue, we retested their wrist strength. And we found that wrist strength remained low, never returned to baseline, even up to 10 minutes post fatigue. However, we found that our errors increased immediately post fatigue, but after about the 1 minute mark, there was lots of recovery, and there were no differences after the 1 minute mark. So our wrist flexor and extensor fatigue were showed equally impaired performance, which was kind of surprising for us. And it kind of goes against some of the traditional thoughts that the extensors might have an earlier onset of fatigue. We followed this up with a dynamic fatigue protocol. So in this case, the protocol was set up exactly the same way, with the same sort of structure with pre-trials, a fatigue protocol, and then post-trials and recovery. In this case, again, I'm highlighting a project that was the fatigue protocol was done outside of the robot. We have done some stuff since in the robot. In this case, it was a repetitive flexion task where there was a weight and a pulley system. This was much longer fatigue protocol than our isometric. So 5 sets of as many repetitions as you could to failure. The weights were specific to people's individual wrist flexion or extension torques. And some interesting things came up here that were different from our isometric tasks. So for our tracking error metric, it was exactly like our isometric fatigue protocol. After about 1 minute post fatigue, tracking error seemed to be recovered. But what's interesting is that once we started to dig into the other metrics, and these other metrics may reflect other changes within the neuromuscular system, jerk ratio never returned to their baseline measures, even at our 10-minute post-task termination measure. And figural error, which again was this recreation of the shape regardless of speed, that returned to baseline, but at about the halfway point in terms of our measurements. We measured up to 10 minutes out from the fatigue protocol, and statistically speaking, figural error didn't return to baseline until about 4 minutes after task termination. We also found that there were some sex differences in the dynamic fatigue protocol that weren't apparent in our isometric tests. So males tracked the target with less errors overall than females. But we found the same consistent finding that hand tracking accuracy was similarly impaired following repetitive submaximal dynamic wrist flexion or extension. However, we did see that the effects of performance fatigability were much longer lasting than our previous isometric protocols. I'm running out of time here, so I'll speed things up. But just quickly, I wanted to highlight some of our sensory motor tests that we've been doing. So we've been using our robot and partner with some really bright people in Italy on this work. And we've been doing a number of different projects to look at how fatigue alters wrist mechanics. And this is another picture of one of our newer robotic devices. And we've shown that we can develop these robotic tests that will apply perturbations to the wrist, so rapid rotations in different directions. And that allows us to calculate things like wrist stiffness. And we've shown that fatigue affects these biomechanical properties. Stiffness can be affected for long durations post a fatigue protocol. And we've also shown we use the robot to do proprioception measures, or having people recreate joint angles and matching joint angles from like a blindfolded state, which is a common proprioception test. And we see that errors are induced during the fatigue protocols as well. But we've been working quite a bit on these sensory motor tests to try to evaluate fatigue progression. So the take-home messages here are that robot-aided assessments provide accurate and repeatable measures. We've developed these protocols to monitor things like wrist mechanics, proprioception, and performance. Fatigue impairs hand function, there's no question, and it can have a change, it can change wrist biomechanical properties. To my earlier point, though, the outcomes vary depending on the types of fatigue that are being introduced. The type of fatigue protocol will lend itself more or less to central versus peripheral mechanisms. And so this needs to be highly considered when we think about the future work around biomarkers for injury risk. We've done some work to show that grip and wrist force variability could give us some idea of the type of impairments and how quickly they recover. Our wrist stiffness and proprioception measures seem to be sensitive markers, irrespective of the type of fatigue that's being induced. And our jerk ratio metric seems to indicate ongoing insight into neurocompensation, getting a little bit at central mechanisms as opposed to just peripheral ones for the protocol. We got much more work that we need to do in this area before we finalize and come up with more conclusive biomarker evidence. And so just to wrap things up, bringing it all back full circle to Trevor's point at the beginning here, reframing repetition. And so hopefully you're getting the sense from my talk that fatigue is complex and there's a lot of variables at play here, from the central and peripheral mechanisms and the type of fatigue and how it's induced. But repetitive motion results likely in inadequate recovery, and that results in forearm muscle fatigue. And I think the next step for a lot of our work is to think about how this relates to complex or more complex force time histories. A lot of what we've done so far have been acute measures of fatigue with isometric and dynamic contractions, but we need to explore the impact of repetition much more. But it's likely that the primary hazard may be insufficient recovery of forearm and hand muscles, and not necessarily repetition per se. And there's some work, some of my colleagues here in Canada, Mike Son, and many of you are probably familiar with the name Jim Potvin. They've done some really great work that I think we can build on in this area, where the research demonstrates that force and duty cycle together define the force time exposures. And so we need to think more about this opportunity for recovery and how recovery gets built in. And some of these maximal acceptable efforts and the RCRA, the recommended cumulative rest allowance equations, try to get at this piece a little bit in more detail than some of the traditional assessment tools. So Mike Son's study really was one of the first to look at this repetitive hand gripping task from a pyramid perspective. And they had people do contractions at different intensities up to about 45%, incrementally increase their intensity, and then deramp their intensity from 45 to 30 to 15 to 0. And they showed really interesting that fatigue didn't increase uniformly. So how the effort is sequenced actually matters. So intermittent low force segments can allow for partial recovery within an overall fatiguing cycle. So fatigue accumulation is definitely history dependent. And their work showed that really nicely, that at the same force levels, the effects on fatigue depend on what force profiles came before it. So this supports a force recovery time model of risk. And I think we need to spend more time understanding it's not just about repetitions per minute. We also need to think longer about the need to understand the sequence and the timing of the demands. So my final thoughts are that fatigue does not necessarily have an immediate performance failure. Fatigue can also be both protective and harmful. So, fatigue can be functional and adaptive in some contexts, but it can also be maladaptive when you ignore warning signs. And it's important, I think, for us to continue down this road of monitoring fatigue with wearables and sensory motor tests because objective and subjective fatigue tend to mismatch. Workers' perception, especially at high duty cycles, are not often not good at capturing overall fatigue. So we need to keep moving towards figuring out how to develop these biomarkers or early warning biomarkers uh, rather than waiting for pain or performance failure to be our signal. So with that, I want to thank you all for listening, and my contact information is here on the screen if anybody would like to contact me later. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. Dwayne, how are we doing for questions there?
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, we have a few here. The first one is, as a general rule, is the recovery time significantly longer for post-isometric contractions versus a dynamic contraction of the wrist?
Um, I wish I had easy answers to these types of questions. There's so many of these answers. I want to say it depends, and it really does. Not always. So for the most part, we would actually see that isometric contractions tend to have quicker recovery than dynamic contractions. However, it's important to remember that we need to, when I say that, we need to make sure that it's not fair if we don't compare the two types of tasks equally. And if one type of tasks, if an isometric contraction like I've showed, that's a maximal contraction, people may only be doing that task for a very brief amount of time versus a dynamic contraction that might take people much longer to reach sort of their endpoint fatigue criteria. And so if we don't control all of those variables, it influences the outcome in terms of our recovery calculation. But as a whole, we tend to see that the isometric contractions lead itself to recovery quicker than our dynamic contractions. And it's likely to do with the complexities of fatigue. An isometric contraction will often target peripheral mechanisms and weight the peripheral contribution of the fatigue more versus a dynamic contraction that might be longer duration, extended periods of time. We sort of get peripheral and central contributions to the fatigue, and we see that that will contribute to sort of a longer need for recovery in the end. But
Okay, thank you.
These fatigue questions are tricky.
Yeah, so the next question is, sorry, my phone's going off here. Wondering how applicable this would be to light physicality with increased repetition of something like typing.
That's a great question. I wish It's a really good question because we've been doing some work in this area, and I wish I had more time to talk about it in more detail. Maybe a future webinar. We've been looking at this in office ergonomic settings for a little bit of time now. We've kind of taken an interesting approach with it, though. I had a student a few years ago who was very interested in the gaming world. And a lot of gamers use computer mice and keyboards as their peripheral of choice as opposed to a console game. So there's a lot of similarities between gaming and office work, but we viewed it as a bit of an accelerated model because these gamers spend enormous amounts of time interacting with the keyboard and mouse, and they do much more inputs per minute than a traditional office worker would. So we used it as a bit of an accelerated model. And so we've done quite a bit of work in that where we've had gamers into the lab and we've measured fatigue and we've measured performance metrics and recovery in those settings. So we have some data around this translating really well, I believe, to understanding the effects of long duration, slow onset, low intensity type activities like the question speaks of. In the gaming applications, we've shown that performance does become impaired and errors increase over time with fatigue. But we've also shown that very low intensity contractions. So we also were able to, in those studies, instrument our keyboard and mouse with force transducers. So we actually got the click forces from those people. And, we're talking very, very low efforts, 5-6 Newton forces on a click. But when you're doing hundreds and thousands of them at a time, there is an accumulation of fatigue there. And it does show up in the data afterwards in terms of a performance decrement. We haven't done as much in that area, though, in terms of the recovery piece yet. It's something that we want to look into.
Okay, thank you. Next one is interested to know if any of your research looked into workers with Dupuytren's disease and the contractures that they can cause.
It's another good question, and I would say
That
no.
one's not from me, Mike.
Oh, really? I thought that was planted by you, Trevor.
No, I didn't plant that one.
Excellent. So Trevor said that because we've actually been talking about this, and
I wouldn't have read it if it was from Trevor.
it's
deleted it.
Yeah. So on the surface, no, we haven't done any of that work yet, but it's funny that was brought up because Trevor and I have talked about it, and we're interested in, there's some new technologies that are allowing us to better understand the forces at the hand when we grasp and grip objects. We have really good devices to measure like overall grip force, but it's hard to understand where the pressures and forces are being applied to the digits of the hand. So there's some new technologies that we're exploring that I think are looking positive for us to, I think, do a good job of being able to explore that question in more detail than we could even just a few years ago.
Okay, thanks. There's another one here, and you may have answered this. Is stiffness measured objectively or subjectively in this case?
Yeah, so in our case, it was measured objectively. So we used the robot, and again, I understand that I'm presenting some stuff here with a robot, and not everyone's going to have access to a tool like that to do performance measures and things. But we're working on trying to adapt some of these tools to more real world and user friendly settings. But in this case, yeah, the robot would deliver a rapid, what we call perturbation to the person's hand or wrist. And then when that happens, we're able to measure viscoelastic properties and stiffness from that.
Okay, perfect. One last one, and then I guess we'll move on. What is the role of work stress in this process? Why did you include the variable in your measurements?
Work stress. I mean, I'm not sure. Do they?
Okay, I'll read it again. This is exactly what it says.
Like physical.
What is the role of work stress in this process?
Okay.
Why did you include this variable in your measurement? Maybe it's supposed to say, why did you not? I don't know.
Yeah, maybe it's why did we not, right? Like if it's psychophysical stress, yeah, it's something that we haven't explored to this point. And it's interesting when we talk about dual tasks, to talk about gripping in combination with wrist actions, that inherently builds a little bit of sort of a mental component to our protocols because people have to do these multi actions at one time. So we're starting to do a little bit of the building onto the mental complexities of the tasks, but we haven't at this point built in any, if I'm understanding the question correctly, any of those stress variables at this point.
Yeah, they did. They corrected the question. They said, why did you not? Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, perfect. We'll end it there. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Mike.
Thanks.
Trevor, would you like to get the next presentation rocking and rolling?
Absolutely. So thanks again, Mike. That was great. I'm glad we're finally getting a chance to get that conversation going, stimulating thought, that the term repetitive motion is outdated and needs to be revised. So, yeah, so our next presentation is going to be Ergonomics in Pregnancy, brought to you by my colleagues, Melissa, Andrew, and Jessica. So, guys, if you're all set,
Perfect. Can you hear me okay?
we hear you great.
Awesome. Good afternoon. Well, like I said, good morning. Sorry, everyone. My name is Melissa, and together with Andrew Flanagan and Jessa Montgomery here at OHCOW, we're going to be presenting on ergonomics in pregnancy. Just a brief presentation overview. We're going to introduce ergonomics, what it is, as well as looking at MSDs in general, along with the body changes that occur during pregnancy. We're going to look at common musculoskeletal disorders that occur among pregnant workers, look at the risk factors that contribute to MSDs, along with pregnancy outcomes associated with these risk factors, and finally close with workplace party responsibilities. So what is ergonomics? So we'll take it back to the basics here. And when we look at the definition from the International Ergonomics Association, it defines ergonomics as the scientific discipline concerned with the understanding of interactions among humans and other elements of a system, and the profession that applies theory, principles, data, and methods to design in order to optimize human well-being and overall system performance. So that's a pretty wordy definition. What it essentially is saying is that ergonomics focuses on designing systems that fit people. They want to improve both well-being and performance. The diagram on the right really shows how ergonomics kind of encompasses all these different fields. We're looking at machine design, task design, human factors, and how all together these design tasks are like humans are centered in the middle of it. You often hear in ergonomics these catchphrases like fitting the job to the worker or working smarter, not harder. So when we look at pregnant women and why we should be concerned about MSDs, first, I'm sure a lot of people know musculoskeletal disorders, what we're talking about, but just briefly, it's a broad category of injuries that affect our muscles, bones, joints, nerves, and connective tissues. They develop when the body's exposed to physical demands that exceed the tissues, what they can comfortably handle. So during pregnancy, the body is undergoing some major physical changes. Things like shifts in posture, you have changes in balance, increased joint laxity, and added load to the spine and pelvis. These kind of changes can make pregnant women more vulnerable to developing musculoskeletal disorders, especially if they were in jobs already that subjected them to force, repetition, awkward postures, or prolonged sitting. So by understanding how the body changes during pregnancies, we can recognize the MSD risk factors in the workplace. And in combination of knowing your rights as a pregnant worker, you can significantly reduce the likelihood of developing an injury. So there are some tissue changes that affect the musculoskeletal system during pregnancy. So during pregnancies, there's releasing of several hormones. So they include relaxin, estrogen, progesterone, prolactin, and oxytocin. What they do is they cause the muscles and ligaments, tendons, and other connective tissue to actually loosen and relax. This softening is a normal and it's a necessary part of childbirth because it's in preparation for it. As these tissues loosen, though, the joints gain more mobility. And we know if you have more mobility in a joint, you're going to have reduced stability. So this is especially in those weight-bearing joints like the ankles and the knees. When joints are less stable, they're more vulnerable to sprains, strains, and also other musculoskeletal disorders. The other thing you need to address here is the whole spinal curvature. So research has shown that changes in spinal curvature during pregnancy vary widely from person to person. Some pregnant individuals experience an increase in lordotic curve, and others, which is in the lower back, and then others might have more in the upper back curve. These shifts are the body's way of adapting to a growing abdomen and changes in the center of gravity because your stomach's growing out, so the center of gravity is also moving anteriorly. The evidence is mixed, but several studies suggest that third trimester, some pregnant women develop an anterior pelvic tilt. This is where the pelvis tips forward. The forward tilt can contribute to feelings of instability or even a loss of balance, especially as pregnancy progresses. However, there's other research that points to weakened abdominal muscles as contributing factor to the increased anterior pelvic tilt. So as the abdominal wall stretches, it provides less support to the spine and the pelvis, which influences our posture and stability. So overall, the changes highlight why pregnant women may be more vulnerable to a muscular strain. So this diagram here, it's a visual that compares posture in the early stages of pregnancy, highlighting how as the fetus grows, it shifts the person's center of gravity and places new demands on the musculoskeletal system. The changes are normal, but they help explain why a pregnant woman experiences the back pain or the fatigue and the balance challenges. So you can see here in the early stage on the left-hand side, the spine maintains its typical curvature. You know, the low back and the upper back are typically normal curvature. The pelvic tilt is minimal, and the center of gravity is relatively the same. It remains the same position. The muscles are generally balanced, and there's no major lengthening or tightening yet. However, on the far right, when you look at the late pregnancy, as the abdomen grows and the weight shifts forward, the several compensations occur. So you have an increase in the spine curve, both in the lumbar and the thoracic. You have the pelvic tilt is more anterior, so it's exaggerating this lower back curve. You have a shift in the center of gravity. So it actually moves forward, requiring kind of constant muscular adjustments to maintain balance. And then you have changes in the muscles. So you have the abs and the upper back muscles becoming more stretched and weakened, where in the low back, hip flexors, and thigh muscles, they actually become more tight and shortened. So looking at some other changes and how pregnancy affects like trunk range of motion and overall stability. So specifically looking at trunk range of motion, research shows that as pregnancy progresses, some individuals naturally increase their posterior trunk lean. It seems to be a compensatory strategy, essentially, a way to reduce discomfort as, the abdomen is growing forward and putting less stress, or what means to kind of try to put less stress on the back, but actually your low back stress is increasing. We also see the lumbar flexion, especially in the sitting posture, is reduced later in pregnancy. This is speculated to be due to the mechanical limitations and a protective response to avoid putting further stress on the lumbar spine. Interestingly, though, when you look at the lateral bend, so that side to side movement, there's not really a significant change across pregnancy. So while you see forward and backward movement is affected, lateral mobility remains relatively stable. Looking at stability and balance, as the fetus grows, we talked about this before, the center of mass gradually shifts forward. The shift changes the body's balance demands and again requires those constant postural adjustments. So even though most individuals adapt well, evidence has shown that stability and balance do decrease in that third trimester. So next we'll look at how pregnancy affects gait and key anthropometric measures. So when we compare pregnant and non-pregnant individuals, we consistently see these changes in walking patterns. Pregnant women, they tend to walk slower, they may take shorter steps, and there's a longer pause between each step. The adaptations are believed for two main things. First, to reduce the risk of falling because you have these different balance demands that are increasing. And second, in some cases, is to help manage the pelvic girdle pain. When we look at the anthropometric changes, pregnancy brings on these predictable changes in our body dimensions. Obviously, total body mass is increasing with more significant gains occurring in the third trimester. There's an increase in thoracic breadth, gluteal girth, calf girth, and skin fold measurements at both the biceps and the triceps. The trunk lengthens and the abdominal girth expands substantially as the fetus grows. So another important change that happens in pregnancy is this whole idea of water retention. And this is what leads to increased swelling that's seen in the ankles and feet. And again, this especially occurs later in pregnancy. There are some common musculoskeletal disorders that are associated with pregnancy, and one that I've certain a lot of people have heard of is carpal tunnel syndrome. So CTS, just in general, is that a condition that occurs when the median nerve becomes compressed as it passes through the carpal tunnel at the wrist. What happens during pregnancy is there's hormonal changes that can lead to the increased swelling in the hands, arms, and even the legs. So again, this fluid retention actually raises the pressure within the carpal tunnel, which increases the likelihood of developing CTS. The incidence of CTS tends to rise in that third trimester, again, as I said previously, because you have that water retention, so you have increased swelling. It's typically at its peak in that third trimester. However, good news is that typically within 2 months after childbirth, as the hormone levels become to normalize and swelling subsides, CTS actually will go away. The symptoms of CTS in pregnancy are similar. You're going to have pain, tingling, numbness, reduced hand strength. And these symptoms interfere with everyday activities, right? Especially those that require motor control or sustained gripping. So to help reduce the risk of CTS, it's important to avoid activities that involve repetitive or forceful hand and wrist movements. And another common MSD associated with pregnancy is back pain. It's extremely common during pregnancy. In a 2023 systematic review and meta-analysis reported that about 40% of pregnant workers actually experience back pain at work. One major contributor is postural adaptation we discussed earlier. So that whole aspect of when your center of gravity is, changed, it's going to cause all these different postural adaptations to try to maintain our balance. So the other is there's physiological factors that are at play. So the hormonal changes lead to relaxation of the connective tissue, which then increases joint mobility, but it can also reduce the stability. So combined with poor body mechanics or simple or muscle fatigue, the changes can significantly increase the likelihood of back pain. However, there is some encouraging evidence that has been looking at exercise, and prenatal exercise programs have been shown to reduce the severity of low back pain during pregnancy and even childbirth. However, the caveat here, the research also shows that exercise does not necessarily reduce the odds of developing back pain in the first place.
All right, thanks, Melissa. I'm Andrew. I'm just going to take over from here. So I'm going to be reviewing the risk factors for MSDs today. And before we get into the risk factors, I just want you to keep in mind in these next few slides that this is focusing on MSD risk for the pregnant worker themselves. We did work with an interdisciplinary team to review literature and develop a slide explaining the impact that these risk factors have on outcomes of pregnancy. And I'll get to that later in the presentation. So just for now, keeping in mind that these are risk factors for MSDs amongst pregnant workers. The first factor that we're going to review is force, and specifically lifting and carrying. Due to the changes that can occur in the spine, as well as the growth of the abdomen, the lifting postures of pregnant women can vary greatly, especially in the third trimester, as Melissa just outlined. So anthropometric data from pregnant women in the US showed increases in abdominal depth range on average from 4.2 centimeters at 20 weeks to 12 centimeters by 37 to 38 weeks. There was also a longitudinal study of 17 women from 16 to 36 weeks that found that the sagittal plane anterior reach, or their functional forward reach, base decreased by approximately 25%. So these bodily changes can result in postural changes during pregnancy, requiring an increased forward reach and thereby increasing the amount of force required from the worker to lift or carry objects, proportionally increasing spinal loading. These risks are most prominent during the third trimester when the reaching distance is the greatest. So if we look at the image here, in the left, the woman is lifting 10 pounds, has about 65 pounds of pressure on her lower back. And when the same person is 9 months pregnant, just due to the forward reach, this task places approximately 150 pounds of pressure on her lower back. Continuing on, excuse me. Continuing on with the risk factor of force and lifting in particular, the NIOSH lifting equation was adapted in 2012 to derive recommended weight limits for pregnant workers. This was from a study by Waters et al., like I said, in 2012. The paper was titled Provisional Recommended Weight Limits for Manual Lifts During Pregnancy. It's a great read, and this is a great tool that came from that paper, or that's included in that paper, to use to determine whether or not a lifting task is acceptable for a pregnant worker to complete, or if alternative solutions should be evaluated. So if we just do a quick run through example here, you can see the conditions that I've outlined. So we have a worker lifting a 16-pound box every minute. The task is repeated for 2 hours. The handle height of the box is 18 inches above the floor. Forward reach is 21 inches, and the worker is 22 weeks into their pregnancy. So if we go through the flow chart here, starting in the top left corner, at work, do you perform lifting tasks more than once every 5 minutes? In this case, we know the worker is performing a lift every minute, so the answer would be yes. Moving us over to, do you lift more than 3 times per minute? And the answer to this is no, because we know they're doing 1 lift per minute. How many hours per day do you spend lifting at work? We know that this task was repeated for 2 hours, so we would select 1 or more hours per day. And then next we have on the left less than 20 weeks, or on the right more than 20 weeks. So we see that the worker was 22 weeks into their pregnancy. So we would select the chart on the right at 20 weeks or more of gestation, with the handle height 18 inches above the floor and the forward reach at 21 inches. We can see that that would put us in a category that would recommend 9-pound lift. So we could safely say that a 6-pound box would exceed the amount that should be lifted by a worker this far into their pregnancy, and the task should be evaluated. And I think it's important to note here that even if a lift is within these guidelines, if a worker feels uncomfortable, we would always recommend that they speak with their employer, their safety representative, or the prenatal care provider for assistance with this. It's very important to note that there are a lot of limitations to this tool. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to read this list to you, but if you do want to use this tool in the future, you can always come back to it. It's very important to be aware that these limitations exist. And then furthermore, if you do want to use this tool, but you don't feel comfortable measuring reach distances or any of the other variables that I mentioned, please contact an ergonomist for assistance. In addition to these guidelines that were laid out by Waters et al. In 2012, according to the obstetricians and gynecologists of Canada, lifting tasks should be discussed with your care provider include lifting more than 23 kilograms or 50 pounds after the 20th week of pregnancy, lifting more than 11 kilograms or 24 pounds after the 24th week, or needing to lift any heavy items after the 30th week of pregnancy. Moving into pushing and pulling tasks. For pushing and pulling tasks, workers should adhere to standard pushing and pulling guidelines, or to the extent that the pregnant worker feels comfortable performing these tasks. The link on the slide here, the online Liberty Mutual manual material handling population percentiles are based on Liberty Mutual manual material handling equations that were published by Potvin et al. In 2021. And this manual material handling analysis online tool provides population percentiles capable of performing MMH tasks without perceived overexertion. So if we're trying to understand how much a person can safely push or pull, this is a great tool to use. So here's an example of this tool that's available online at the link. So in this case, we've selected push as the task type, imperial units, frequency as pushes per hour, a frequency of 4, or also could be thought of as once every 15 minutes. The initial push force required is 70 pounds. Sustained force required, sustained force, we have 25 pounds. We're pushing the box 20 feet, and we have a vertical push hand height of 40 inches above the floor. So then we select calculate, and in this case, it tells us that for women, 47% of the population is capable of the initial force requirement, and greater than 90% are capable of the sustained force. So in this case, we would want to evaluate ways to control the initial force requirement. And there's instructions for using this tool on the website, as well as instructions for interpreting the results. But just as I said on the previous slide, if there's anything that you feel uncomfortable with in getting these measurements to use this tool safely, please contact an ergonomist. With keeping pushing and pulling in mind, weight gain, abdominal growth, increased circulating relaxin hormones, stretched abdominal muscles, an increased amount of interstitial fluid in the extremities affecting sensory input are contributing factors to changes in balance. So pregnant women are at a heightened risk of falling due to this change in balance as a result of these factors affecting a change in their center of gravity, as Melissa mentioned. So changes in balance are different for every pregnancy, and every pregnant woman should be mindful of these changes when performing manual material handling tasks, in particular when pushing and pulling, lifting, carrying, etc. As a final note on force and pregnancy, pregnant workers should talk to their employer and healthcare provider if they experience unpredictable loads in their work. Excuse me. These can be seen in professions such as PSWs, or personal support workers, nurses who perform patient handling tasks, as well as any first responders who may experience emergency situations. These are a couple of examples. I'm sure there's many more out there. But these are examples where a worker may encounter an unpredictable amount of force in their work. So care should be taken to approach these situations with a plan whenever possible. The next risk factor that we're going to look at is posture. And the effects of pregnancy on posture are different for every individual, as each woman's body changes differently. Common changes that do impact posture are curvature of the spine, anterior tilt of the pelvis, hyperextended knees, and abdominal girth. The key to controlling postural risk factors is to be aware of the neutral body posture. And when we say neutral body posture, this is the position which minimizes stress on the body and is the safest, most effective position to work. So thinking of resting alignment of the body where the joints are not bent or twisted, not fully extended or flexed, and the spine maintains its neutral S-curve. Getting into static postures. Static postures involve holding a fixed body position for extended periods. This can result in increased muscular effort, inhibit blood flow, and lead to fatigue or injury. Standing is an example of a task that requires prolonged static posture. And according to the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, after a period of prolonged standing, a pregnant worker may experience dizziness, hypertension, and back pain. The obstetricians and gynecologists of Canada recommend talking to your healthcare provider and your employer if you're required to stand for more than 4 hours at a time. Another example of a task that often requires static posture is using input devices such as a keyboard and mouse at a computer workstation for extended periods of time. Pregnant workers may need to adjust their workstation throughout their pregnancy to ensure it fits them as best possible. Examples of changes that could affect posture during pregnancy at a computer workstation could be reduced lumbar flexion. This could result in changes to backrest angle and seat pan depth. Lumbar support may need to be adjusted based on changes to lordotic and kyphotic angles of the spine, and changes to the body may require the repositioning of armrests, as well as adjusting any input device positions such as your mouse, keyboard, or keyboard tray to minimize reach and keep things as close to your body as possible. OHCOW's Office Ergonomics reference guide can help with adjusting your computer workstation to allow neutral body postures. And if you need additional support, you can contact an OHCOW ergonomist. Moving into dynamic postures. Dynamic posture is the alignment and control of the body while in motion. So to best control dynamic posture's effects on the body, we should identify tasks at work that you complete regularly and strategize how you can adapt these tasks to the bodily changes that come with pregnancy. We should think about keeping forward reaches to the primary zone whenever possible, as you can see in the one image here, by keeping tasks as close to our body as possible. For lifting and manual material handling tasks, we should keep to the power zone. That's the green highlighted area in the image with the pregnant woman. And pregnant workers should avoid reaching overhead or below the knees whenever possible. In relation to posture, the Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada recommend speaking with your employer and healthcare provider if you are stooping or bending more than 10 times per hour, or stooping or bending or climbing ladders after the 28th week of pregnancy. Moving into the risk factor of repetition, repetition should be thought of as performing the same or similar movements or tasks over a given period of time by the same body segment or muscle group. Repetition becomes a risk when the body segments are not getting enough rest to recover. And we can think about this in the way that this graph describes. So if we look at the humps going along the x-axis of this graph, each of these humps where we see a rise in load represents one lift or one exertion of force. Between the load line and the tissue tolerance line above, we see the margin of safety. At rest, the margin of safety gap is large, and as we exert load, the gap representing the margin of safety decreases. As these exertions continue, we can see that the tissue tolerance drops and the margin of safety becomes smaller. If we were to continue to perform these repetitions, exerting this force, eventually there'd be no margin of safety and our tissues will not be able to tolerate these movements. This can potentially result in injury. And then finally, when we rest, we can see that the tissue tolerance rises back to a normal recovered level. Given the changes that occur in the body during pregnancy, we must consider tissue tolerance may be different for pregnant workers in certain body segments than for non-pregnant workers. So a pregnant woman may be at a higher risk. Looking at the risk factor of whole body vibration, whole body vibration is vibration from surfaces of machines, vehicles, equipment that moves through the worker's body, into the worker's body, through the buttocks, back, or feet. Evidence supports that all workers who are exposed to whole body vibration are at increased low back pain and sciatica. In Ontario, it's recommended that Ontario workplaces implement controls when daily exposure to whole body vibration reaches 0.43 meters per second squared for all workers. And the specific impacts that exposures to whole body vibration have during pregnancy on the spine have not been extensively studied. However, back pain is already more common amongst pregnant workers, and it's therefore possible that the anatomical changes in pregnant workers may make them more susceptible to low back pain from whole body vibration. Noise can cause activation of the sympathetic and endocrine systems, and these activations can lead to elevated blood pressure, increased heart rate, and increased levels of stress hormones. So exposure to continuous noise above the recommended guideline of 85 decibels for more than 8 hours may lead to hearing impairment for all workers. And it's important to note that exposure to these levels can also cause harm to the hearing of a developing fetus, as the sound can carry through a pregnant person's body. So workers can wear hearing protection, but you can't necessarily put that hearing protection on the baby. Looking at heat and cold exposure, working in extreme heat can increase the risk of dehydration and heat exhaustion, which can result in overexertion for a worker and negatively impact a growing fetus. It's suggested that flexibility of work location and additional cooling hydration breaks should be allowed for pregnant workers. Likewise, statistically significant associations have been found between occupational cold exposure and shoulder pain, as well as low back pain. Mechanism for cold-induced MSTs is not well established, but some explanations have been suggested, and one study from Lewis et al. In 2023 showed an increase in muscle activation, frequency, and duration due to exposure to cold conditions in several upper extremity muscles during repetitive work in temperatures between 4 and 10 degrees Celsius. 4 and 10 degrees Celsius is sounding pretty warm right now from where I'm located. Sorry, I had to add that in there. For more information about heat stress and cold stress, please visit the resources that can be found under these tools on the slide. These resources are on the OHCOW website, or you can always contact us. Of course, we also have psychosocial risk factors. So numerous psychosocial risk factors that can cause stress, such as high job demands, low job control, work pace, task variety, high job strain, low job security, and long or uncontrolled working hours can contribute to the development of MSDs in all workers. High levels of stress during pregnancy are associated with a number of adverse psychological and physiological outcomes for the mother and the child. If you're interested in learning more about psychosocial hazards in your workplace, Stress Assess is an online survey tool designed for workers and managers who are interested in assessing psychosocial hazards in the workplace. It anonymously, collectively, and confidentially identifies issues. And this can be found at stressassess.ca, as you can see on the slide here. Being aware that risk factors for pregnancy outcomes is not really within the scope of an ergonomist. This slide was reviewed by an interdisciplinary team, including a nurse and a physician, and some workplace MSD risk factors are associated with more common adverse pregnancy outcomes, such as preterm birth, low birth weight, or spontaneous abortion. Associations, so not necessarily causation, have been reported with prolonged standing of more than 3 or 4 hours per day, heavy or repetitive lifting, awkward or sustained postures, high physical workload, high psychosocial stress, and inflexible working conditions. Chances of adverse outcomes may increase when the risk factors are combined. And most importantly, the big takeaway from this slide, all pregnancies are unique and subjective. So speak with your health and safety representatives, your employer, and your prenatal care provider if you have any concerns about the safety of your pregnancy at work. And one last note from me here, as Melissa kind of touched on, there is some evidence that suggests that we can be proactive, and when women are provided with specific physical activity recommendations in preparation for pregnancy, they may feel empowered and better prepared to face musculoskeletal issues that may rise both during and following pregnancy. So speak with your physiotherapist or healthcare provider to see if they have any recommendations regarding proactive exercise for women who are preparing for their pregnancy. And now I'm going to turn things over to Jessica Montgomery, who's going to discuss workplace parties' responsibility supporting pregnant and birthing workers.
Thanks, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Perfect. Okay, so this portion of the presentation outlines the shared responsibilities of employers, unions, as well as workers in supporting pregnant and birthing employees, specifically with a focus on communication, legal rights, and workplace accommodations. Okay, so the disclaimer here is that this portion of the presentation provides information based on Ontario legislation. So participants joining from other provinces or countries should review the legislation that applies in their own area, as it may differ. So legal rights and duty to accommodate. So pregnancy and the postpartum period are protected grounds under the Ontario Human Rights Code. And employers and unions have a legal obligation to accommodate and participate in the accommodation process, unless doing so would cause undue hardship. So workers have the right to a safe and healthy workplace, but they also have the right to a reasonable accommodation. And employers and unions share this duty to accommodate up to and including undue hardship. So workplace accommodations. So the accommodation process is an individualized process that may evolve throughout the pregnant or birthing worker's pregnancy. Most accommodations are simple and practical. However, they are not to be taken as like a one-size-fits-all deal. And what works for one worker may not work for another worker. And what may work in one of the worker's pregnancies may not work in another if should they become pregnant later on in their career. So this is a list of potential workplace accommodations. So some examples are, well, we're going to modify the worker's work duties and their tasks. We're going to allow for flexible hours and scheduling, additional and flexible breaks. Of course, they need time off to attend their medical appointments, transitioning between sitting and standing positions, allow for uniform or clothing modifications, and of course, we have to make sure that the pregnant worker has proper and well-fitting personal protective equipment. And it's important to note that throughout the duration of the pregnancy, that the worker may require multiple sets of this, of their uniform or clothing or whatever they're required to wear. So the worker's responsibilities. So we know that workers play an active role in the accommodation process. And this is firstly by ensuring that they are communicating early, they're following medical advice from their primary care physician, and working with the employer and the union to ensure that they reduce their risks. So it's important that workers know their rights. So we know that under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, we have these fundamental rights of the right to know, the right to refuse, the right to participate. But under the human rights umbrella, we have this additional duty to accommodate. It's important that the pregnant and birthing workers work within their functional abilities and their restrictions. And if the worker's function abilities change, or if the worker is having difficulties or experiencing pain or discomfort, they should advise their employer or supervisor immediately and seek medical attention. So when reviewing possible accommodations, the worker is the best person to advise as to what tasks they can complete, which ones they may have difficulties which they may have difficulties with, and then which ones they may need assistance with, or if which tasks we can change to allow that work to fit that worker. So the employer's responsibilities. So employers have a legal responsibility and requirement to accommodate pregnant or birthing persons under the Ontario Human Rights Code. Again, it's a protected ground under sex and family status. And pregnancy and that duty to accommodate begins as soon as the employer becomes aware of the pregnancy or pregnancy-related needs. So this duty means that employers must take every reasonable precaution and step to ensure that the workplace is safe and accessible to the pregnant worker. And it's not enough to wait for the worker to struggle, or for their colleagues to see them struggle, or for the employer to simply say, we can't accommodate, or the accommodations are not possible here. So employers must take and explore every reasonable option and engage in the accommodation process in good faith. Again, accommodations must be individualized because every pregnancy is different, and what works for one worker may not work for another. And employers need to assess the worker's duties, their environment, their functional abilities, medical restrictions, and adjust that worker's work accordingly. So again, the accommodation process is ongoing. So as the pregnancy progresses, a worker's needs may change, and employers are required to reassess and modify the accommodations as required, rather than treating the accommodation process as like a one-size-fits-all or a one-time shot deal. So the union's responsibilities. So if the workplace is unionized, the union is identified as a workplace party. So unions play an important role as a workplace party in the accommodation process to ensure that the pregnant and birthing workers are treated fairly and safely in the workplace. So during the accommodation process, the union has a shared responsibility alongside the employer to facilitate reasonable accommodations. And unions have the responsibility to actively support pregnant workers by, listening to their concerns, ensure that they're fully aware of their rights, and advocating for accommodations that allow the worker to stay in the workplace and to continue working safely. Also to ensure that the workers duties and the worker's dignity is upheld. So unions have a duty to participate meaningfully in the accommodation process. So they're required to engage in conversations with the employer, review proposed accommodations, and ensure that any changes to the duties, working conditions, hours do not negatively impact the worker, and to ensure that their human rights are upheld. So pregnancy and parental leave. So this is Canadian-wide, the pregnancy and parental leave here listed. So pregnant and birthing workers have the legal right to take birth protected leave as well as parental leave to ensure and to be able to return to their job afterwards. So a worker cannot be treated differently. They cannot be disciplined or terminated because they are pregnant or because they choose to take leave. Their employment must be protected and they must be able to return to work safely. So a pregnant birthing worker also cannot be forced to take maternity leave or sick leave if they don't want to. And they also can't be disciplined for requesting any pregnancy-related workplace accommodations. So the right to breastfeed and express milk. So after giving birth, workers have the legal right to breastfeed or express milk at work. And employers have the duty to accommodate these needs as a part of their obligation under the Ontario Human Rights Code. So this includes providing the worker with a safe, private, and clean space that is not a washroom. And employers are also required to provide appropriate milk storage, such as access to a refrigerator. And workers may also now require longer or more frequent breaks to breastfeed or express milk, and these needs must be accommodated. And again, as with the pregnancy accommodations, this process should be individualized. It needs to be flexible and again, may change over time. And it's important that we have open communication between the worker, the employer, and the union to ensure that the workers' needs are met respectfully. Okay, so if issues arise, so it is always encouraged that the worker speaks up if issues arise during their pregnancy or the accommodation process. And it's important that the worker brings the issues forward to their supervisor or manager or human resources, however your workplace structure is, and the union if applicable. So if an internal resolution is impossible, workers do have access to external resources, such as the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Legal Support Center, and workers and birthing persons are protected from retaliation if they do raise concerns or request accommodations, or if they're asserting their any pregnancy related rights. And again, the goal is always early resolution. But again, we all have the right to a respectful workplace, but there are legal protections if any issues persist. And that's it for me, Andrew.
All right, and that concludes our presentation. Here are our references. And we'll open the floor for any questions.
Okay, thank you guys. That was very informative. A little bit new, different topic there. We're a little bit behind, so the chat just disappeared on me. Hold on. Trying to get back to the chat so I can get with the questions. I guess we're not going to do too many questions because here we go. Are there any guidelines for safe lifting and frequency based on the gestational age that you guys happened to come across when you were creating this presentation?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
Are there any guidelines for safe lifting and frequency based upon gestational age that you've identified in your research?
Not directly. Yeah, I guess the short answer for that is no. Like, there's nothing as specific as that that tool that I reviewed that gave a recommended weight limit. It didn't speak, but I guess it kind of touched on frequency. It was based on number of lifts, but not exactly. There is no specific tool addressing that. Yeah.
Okay. One other thing, what happened in my chat was the Slido popped up. So if everybody would be so kind as to fill out the survey with the Slido, that would be great. There was one here on driving, but it disappeared on me again. Sorry. Do you have any suggestions for individuals that work as PSWs or EMS workers to manage heavy or unpredictable loads while pregnant?
Sorry, suggestions for, just repeat that one more time.
It disappeared again. PSWs or EMS workers to manage heavy or unpredictable loads.
Yeah, I would say just talking it through with your safety representative, your employer, because you know that you're probably going to, if you know that you're going to be experiencing those types of situations, you want to have a plan for when it happens. So whatever that plan may be, that would be between you and whatever you come up with your employer. That's probably about the best advice I could give.
Okay. Have you seen any research involving the impact on the shoulders after prolonged sitting and circulatory issues for people that drive a lot? Obviously, we're talking about individuals that are pregnant.
I haven't seen any particular research on it, but I could see how maybe there'd be an additional forward reach, right? If they're having to sit a little further back due to the changes in size of the abdomen, but I haven't seen that particular research.
Okay, perfect. We'll stop it there. If we didn't get to a specific question that you had, you can potentially send an email to one of the presenters of this presentation, and hopefully they can get back to you with it. I just want to emphasize again that we do have the Slido up there. Could Andrew show the second slide of the references again?
I think I scrolled up. I think I did scroll up to that, but if that person still is looking for more, this will be shared, like, right? We'll be posting this presentation. So I would say hop on the OHCOW website and you'll be able to see it posted there, or send us an email.
Okay, well, we'll end it there. We'll turn it back over to Trevor to conclude the day. Thank you for the presentation, Andrew, Melissa, and Jessica. That was awesome.
Yes, thank you, guys. That was great. And thank you, Dwayne, for moderating the chat today. I do want to apologize again. You know anyone that was not able to get in despite our numerous attempts at reaching people? Please let them know that session was recorded. It'll be on our YouTube channel this week. And also at the same time, we will not have this issue next week. Steps are already being taken to ensure it doesn't happen again. Now, again, I do invite you all to return next week for our session where we'll be having a look at a new workplace assessment tool called PERAT. The topic is simplifying ergonomic risk. A look at the preliminary ergonomic risk assessment tool, PERAT. And also another presentation called From Pixels to Prevention, how AI is changing ergonomic assessments. So with that being said, I'd like to thank everyone for staying with us today through all the kerfuffle, and I wish you all a good week, and we'll see you next week. Thank you very much.